Yes, I think we should start now. Dr. Kapil, Dr. Filbert.
All right.
Start the presentation for now.
Okay, so good morning to participants from Europe and Africa region. Good afternoon to participants from Asia region, and good day to everyone. So welcome to the fourth session of ISIC 2022. Dr. Kapil Gupta and I will chair this session. In this session, we have one keynote speaker, which is Dr. Ernesto Jiménez-Ruiz, followed by five presentations, and also another keynote by Dr. Sven Grope. Without further ado, let me read the biography of our keynote speaker, Dr. Ernesto. So Ernesto Jiménez-Ruiz is a lecturer in artificial intelligence at City University of London, affiliated to the Research Centers for Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. He's also a researcher in the Center for Scalable Data Access, or CERIAS, at the University of Oslo, Norway. He previously held a senior research associate position at the Alan Turing Institute in London and a research assistant position at the University of Oxford. His home university awarded a Premio Extraordinario de Doctorado, roughly translated as an extraordinary doctoral award, to his doctoral thesis, engineering category 2010 to 2011. His research has covered several areas, including biomedical information processing and integration, ontology reuse, ontology versioning and evolution, ontology alignment. His current research interests focus on the application of semantic technology to data science workflows and the combination of knowledge representation and machine learning techniques. And his talk is titled Knowledge Graph for Data Science and Machine Learning. So Professor Ernesto, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me. So the idea of this presentation today is just to provide my 2 cents of what we are doing, or our contribution of knowledge graphs for data science and machine learning. Let me see. Okay. Before I wanted to start with a very small brief introduction to knowledge graph, because nowadays there is a very hot topic. Everyone is talking about knowledge graphs. And I wanted to provide my understanding, or when I talk about knowledge graph, what I meant. And for me, it's some sort of evolution of the notion of semantic web, in a more controlled scenario, where we are not trying to orchestrate and integrate all the data on the web, but we are trying to do so on an organization, in a small setting and more controlled scenario. And then nowadays, knowledge graphs are being used to drive in industry products and make them more intelligent. But of course, this is not new. Like in my case, coming from the semantic web, and many other people coming from knowledge representation and AI, this notion is not new. It's something that has been for more than 50 years around. And then from the logic perspective, we have been working with ontologies and knowledge graphs for a long time. But then what happened is, like Google and many other industries, not only Google, they have relaunched the interest of knowledge graph in industry, which is very important. But at the same time, from the research community, there is a lot of mature technology, which has enabled this very quick transition to the application in industry. And then we have tons of new tools in the semantic web, including query engines. We have strong modeling languages to represent ontologies, and also we have reasoning techniques and tools. But one thing that we shouldn't forget now that everyone is trying to use this notion of knowledge graph is what does it mean? Like I don't want to remove the knowledge from the graph, because many times we see knowledge graph that they are basically graph data. So if we would like to call it knowledge graph, we need to have this extra layer, this extra semantic representation, and that is where ontologies still play a key role in knowledge graph, because they are providing this abstract symbolic representation of the domain. And then, of course, knowledge graph will be nowadays they're like a very large data sets in industry, which is mostly graph data, but then we shouldn't forget about this extra layer that is gonna help orchestrating all this data. And then below I have like my definition, like coming from the semantic web. If I talk about knowledge graph, I'm assuming that it's an OW layer because we have an ontology, and then RDF base because we use RDF as a format to represent the graph data. So now we know now you know already what I mean if I talk about knowledge graphs, so we can move on. And then, well, yeah, just a quick, I assume that most of you in this conference, you know about ontologies, but just a quick reminder, like ontologies will provide the vocabulary of the domain, will have some semantics about how terms they relate to each other. And very importantly, they are formalized using some background logic. In the semantic web, we use OWL that is based on description logics. And that is very important, because we'll constrain what we can represent while at the same time give us good computational properties to do reasoning. It's important there is a logic and there are some clear boundaries of what we mean when we represent something. And yeah, I wanted to put this picture, which is quite interesting, because as I was mentioning, now knowledge graph is a very hot topic. Everyone is talking about that. So it looks VR again, in some sort of peak of inflated expectations. But if you check, which is partially true, this graph, but if you check the following graph, so below you see that in the peak, we have a knowledge graph, but then you compare with this other graph, we also have these ontologies and graph in this very gray area, after the peak of inflated expectation. So my interpretation that is, and I think is the way the community is moving, is like, okay, ontologies and graphs, we already have this peak of inflated expectations. So now we cannot really go back again to the same situation. What it means is now we are moving to this slope and enlightenment somehow, and then we have more mature technology. We already went through this peak of inflated expectations, and now I think we are ready to move to this plateau of productivity. So we are not yet there, but I think we are moving towards there. At least that's the way I interpret the combination of these two graphs, because when I talk about knowledge graph, I'm talking about ontologies and graph data, of course. So let me, so now that was just the introduction to what I mean about knowledge graph. Now I would like to talk about my 2 cents of the contribution of knowledge graphs and semantic web into data science, more specifically to provide semantic understanding of tabular data. So yeah, as you know, like in data science, a lot of time is spent in preparing the data. And then I like this because it is true, like you spend a lot of time preparing the data, and also you spend a lot of time complaining about all this additional preparation. And talking from, we were talking with data science coming from in the finance sector and other industries, and the common problem they have, especially for very junior data scientists, was a complete lack of understanding of the data, and it wasn't obvious. There was this knowledge was somewhere, and possibly in the brains of the more senior data scientists, but the junior data scientists, they were starting fresh, so they didn't really know much about the domain. So the problem is like how to give this, provide this semantics somewhere, not to the data. And basically in one of the projects I was participating in, the Alan Turing Institute, they were identifying what are the key pain points, let's say, or the key challenges in data wrangling tasks. And then I extended this set of points with where semantics could contribute. And of course, like providing a data dictionary will be a very obvious contribution. Of course, it will help in data integration, will help in entity resolution if we provide additional semantics of what the raw data is meaning. But especially at the last point, I think we need some sort of semantic data governance to understand everything, no? And this requires an effort, of course, but it's something that will pay back eventually, no? You really have some sort of knowledge, but that is well represented somewhere, and it's not only on the brains of the more senior data scientists. So, and in this line, we were trying to provide our 2 cents, no? Like how we can semantically enrich data, no? And of course, it's some sort of semantic, semi-automatic process. We can try to automate as much as we can, no? And trying to solve one of the a bit of the pain points on doing this manually. But of course, there should be some validation eventually. No? But our contribution was trying to say, okay, let's try to do it automatically, even though it's not perfect. And then this semantic enrichment or augmentation of data will also be key. You would like to transform your data finally into a knowledge graph, which might not be the final requirement. No? You could just extend your data semantically without transforming to RDF. But of course, ideally, the key will be to transform everything into a knowledge graph, no? And having this everything at the semantic level. And yeah, the key that we originally preserved, no, like not moving to RDF or knowledge graph yet, because I mean, in the end, CSV files are the common exchange format, no? And in any data analytics pipelines, we wanted to stay there in principle. But then the idea was to provide these semantics, no, to so that we can enhance the usability of the CSV files, and that will be very, very important, as we will see in a couple of scenarios later on in the presentation. And gaining this extra semantics will be very helpful. And then coming from the semantic web and trying to provide something, at least some sort of a scenario, no, to evaluate the system. So we identify 3 basic tasks to annotate tabular data. So one, I mean, the most common task is identify if there is an entity mentioned in a cell. So basically it was some sort of identifying a matching between cell and a knowledge graph entity. Another of the tasks we identify is trying to assign a type to a column. In principle, semantic type, no? Like we like to say, okay, this column relates to this knowledge graph class here. Also, data types could be of interest as well. And then finally, we were also very interested in identifying relationships among columns. That was what we identify as the CPA task. You know, that will identify which knowledge graph with which knowledge graph property 2 columns are related. And this was part of a challenge we organized, to match tabular data to existing knowledge graphs. And of course, this assumes that there is a knowledge graph in place, which could be incomplete, but there should be something that is given us some information about the domain, and especially some classes, some ontology describing the domain. And this is just an example, no, what I was meaning about trying to match entity cells to entities. For example, in the first table on the left, we have list of countries and cities, and then we would like to match actually China to the right entity, but especially when there is some sort of ambiguity, we would like to match Congo, well, the string Congo to the right entity, and so on. And also trying to identify relationships, don't say, okay, in one column I have countries and in another column I have cities. It seems like the relationship between these 2 columns is like one is the capital of the other. And similarly with the other table, now where we have a list of companies, and then we would like to have like to relate to the founding year. And then in this line, we, apart from being involved in defining the task and having a challenge so that we have a common evaluation, we also created a system to identify the type of a column that was called ColNet. And I wanted to just to give you a brief introduction to this ColNet system. So it was the main novelty of this system was trying to of course, it needed some training data, but I was building this training data automatically out of a knowledge graph. And then was trying to extract semantics, not only at the cell level, but also at the column level. So trying to analyze, for example, you have a cell that was mentioning Virgin, was trying to also analyze this with respect to what were the other entities in the column, no? Because Virgin could be very ambiguous, no? Was may refer to Mary or to Virgin Media as a broadband company in UK. And so, yeah, one of the novelties as well, or things like it was trying not to assume any metadata, because of course, if you have column metadata that's saying those are cities or countries, then the problem of type identification could be very easy. But in many realistic scenarios, you don't really have any information. You just have data and that's it. Or the column name is not indicative or misleading or empty. So in this case, we were assuming there is no metadata associated. So yeah, what I was saying, like since we rely on a convolutional neural network, we needed some training data, but we were building this training data from the knowledge graph. So basically, we were creating a classifier for each semantic type or class in the knowledge graph, and then we were getting samples from the knowledge graph. And in this case, in this slide, I'm showing samples for the class company. No, I mean, we were using this as what we call general samples of the class company, and every sample was a single or combination of entities. That was a parameter, no? Because you have a single entity, this could be still ambiguous. So the idea was to have like samples that were a combination. So for example, having Apple, Microsoft, and Google as a sample, including 3 entities. And that was leading to much better results. And then we also have what we call particular samples that they're very helpful to do some fine tuning, no? Because the general training could be based on just the knowledge graph. And then once we have some tables at hand, we can do some fine tuning, no? And we can check particular or specific references to companies, no, that appear in the table. And here basically we started with a very basic lookup, no, to understand, okay, which is the potential type of a given mention in the table. And in this case, there was a bit of ambiguity, no, because we have Apple, and then we could retrieve 2 entities actually: the apple, what it means the fruit, or the apple as a company, which in many cases was very interesting, no? Because to train or to fine tune the classifier for companies, we were using the entities for company, no? Like in this case would be Microsoft, Apple, and Google, but then also the cases where there was some ambiguity was also very important to build some negative samples, no? So we were also getting set of entities from fruit, no? So like you have apple and orange, and I mean orange could also be ambiguous, no? But you have apple, banana, then of course this will mean that there is clearly a fruit. But if you have Apple and Microsoft, then this sample will lead to companies. And then just to give you an example, no, for training, you focus mostly on the bottom part. So for the candidate class, for example, US company, we get some particular entities that are coming from a given table. We also get some general entities coming from the knowledge graph, and then some negative samples where we try to exploit the most ambiguous samples, like orange as a fruit, and so on, or apple as a fruit, and then companies that they are not US based. And then the sample will be a combination of entities, like having Google, Amazon, and so on. And then finally in prediction, this one example, no, where we have Google, Amazon, Apple, BlackBerry, and Orange, and we would like to discover which is or at least predict which is the type of this column. And on the bottom side, you have the basic lookup, where I mean, lookup works fine in this case because they discover that there are companies, no? But also discover like it gives a high score to fruit, and that might be sometimes problematic, no? Especially you have a threshold, and then you basically accept everything over a threshold. No? You may end up saying, okay, this column contains companies and fruit, which is not completely right. And by using CallNet, we have a better set of scores. No? So basically, we do classify this as a company or IT company while giving a very low score to fruit. And then the sample 2 is even better, no? Because here we have a set of entities that not all of them appear in the knowledge graph. So by a very basic knowledge graph lookup, the scores are very low. And again, if you have a threshold, you will filter out them. I mean, if you keep the top one, maybe still is fine, no? Because you will get company. But then by a CallNet, what we get is much better scores for company. And given the fact that many of those companies, by the time we were doing the experiments, were not in the knowledge graph we were using. So yeah, this was a bit of an overview of CallNet, no, as a system. No, there are many more systems that they try to predict the semantic type, and also other systems that try to cover all three tasks, no, the CTA, CPA, and CEA. And then it was partially thanks to this SEMTAP challenge, no, that I was already mentioning before, where we realized at some point there were many systems trying to solve this problem of tabular data to knowledge graph matching, but they were using their own data sets, their own metrics, so it was very hard to compare to each other, no? And every paper has like different evaluation and different numbers, no? So one of the efforts we did in the past was trying to create this challenge, which is still running. It's running with the International Semantic Web Conference, and this year we will have the 4th edition of the challenge. And we are creating a nice community around where we have these 3 basic tasks, and also we have different data sets. We have relatively easy data set that has been automatically generated, and also we have some other, not all completely manually created, but with some additional manual input. And then last year we were targeting DBpedia, Wikidata, and schema.org. And then in this challenge, one of the organizers, or a couple of organizers, are from IBM Research, and IBM Research have been always involved in both organization and also providing some sponsorship. So yeah, you are working in this area. I think more participants are always welcome. So yeah, up to now we saw how to annotate tabular data semantically, and that might be the end of the process. No, you augment the CSV file with additional data or additional columns, or you transform some of the columns. But then an additional step will be to expose actually the data as RDF. And here we have different scenarios, no, where we have you have data coming from different databases or sources, and then you would like to do some evaluation. No? And you have different scenarios, as I was saying, like the one in the middle could be where you're just interested in extending the tabular data with additional columns on information. But other scenarios could be like construct a new knowledge graph for your data, or you already have a growing knowledge graph trying to extend this knowledge graph with more information coming from tabular data, no? And exploit this for data access or analytics. And then to expose data as an RDF, of course, you need some sort of mapping between the tabular data to RDF. No? I mean, you could potentially do some sort of automatic transformation without taking into account the semantics. No? But then this will lead to the triples you see in this slide, which are not really that meaningful. They do include the information of the CSV file, no? But probably we can do a bit better. But of course, if you take into account what we were discussing before, no, in the presentation, like how to semantically annotate the table before the transformation, you could lead to much useful set of triple, no? Where you say, okay, China is a country, Beijing is a city, and then China, the capital of China is Beijing, no? And things like that. And then, of course, once you have this very nice set of triples, where there is also an ontology orchestrating this, no? Because you have like countries are connected to cities via has capital and things like that. you can then exploit this to perform queries and then or any other analytics over the graph data. And then of course, if you transform the data into this triple, you can then enhance or enable the use of SparkQL to access, give me the capital of China. And of course, you can go to more powerful queries. And here I wanted to give you an overview of the potential scenarios as well when we expose data as an RDF or as a knowledge graph. So on the left-hand side, we are materializing the data and linking to the ontology we have. While in the right-hand side, we don't materialize, we create some sort of virtual knowledge graph. And it was called in the literature ontology-based data access, where the data stays in relational databases, and then you only materialize according to the queries you are getting. So basically you get SparkQL queries, you transform them into SQL, you retrieve the results, and then you transfer back the results into RDF or into the same format as the SparkQL query was expecting. And there is an application I will mention in a few seconds. Before that, I wanted to give you a use case where semantics would be very helpful in a pure data science pipeline. And so in the LAM Turing, they created a system called DataDiff that was trying to identify changes between different versions of a CSV file. And they were like, well, there are many application use cases, and indeed there were like different projects and different use cases where they were getting the same sort of data every year or every month, but then the format was slightly different. And they were trying to identify which were the changes with respect to the 1 year ago or 1 month ago. Especially they wanted to run the same pipeline. Because of course, if they were changing column names or the order of the columns and so on, of the type of data in a column, and they need to modify the pipeline, and they need to know how to modify it. So the problem with this data diff was a very, very sophisticated system. But then one of the problems is when they were dealing with very large CSV files with many columns, they need to compare many columns to each other. And they were analyzing the distribution of the data and performing some statistical, getting some statistical metrics about this distribution. But then one thing that could have helped in this comparison is trying to understand and provide some semantic information about the type of data before going to this analysis of the distribution of the data. Because it wouldn't make sense to compare, even though they had the same distribution, comparing a column that is talking about countries, another column that is talking about cities, so that you could prevent to just do this comparison, because they're talking about two different things, even though they may contain or have the same data distribution. So that could be a way of enhancing a data science pipeline with semantics. And then another use case, this is the one related with this ontology-based data access, was trying to enhance data access in the oil and gas industry. And that was a project we were working a few years ago. And then we showcased that OBDA could help in this domain. Especially because they have some, or the current setting, or the setting they were working was a bit limited. And because the engineers or the domain experts, they need to access the data to perform some analytics. And they have some predefined queries. And then as long as those predefined queries were covering their needs, that was everything fine. But in many cases, they need more information. And then they need to access or to go through an IT expert or data engineer that this data engineer knows very well about the domain and also knows very well where the data are in the databases. So it's a person that is hard to substitute because it has like a lot of years of training on the domain and also how the data is flying in the databases and in the data sources. So basically there were some information needs from the domain expert to the IT expert. And this person was creating a very specialized query that was in some cases like very big SQL query and very hard to understand. And this process could take several days and even weeks, no? Depending on how hard it was to harness the data. And then sometimes the data was not exactly was in the mind of the domain expert or engineer, and then they need to go back and trying to refine the query. So it could take several days and worst case, even weeks. So the idea we have in this project is trying to, okay, what if the domain expert defines queries according to an ontology? And then we transform those queries according to the ontology that will be SPARQL queries into SQL queries. And in this way, of course, here it looks like the data engineer or IT expert is gone, but he's working in the back end. No? Is defining their duty instead of creating one-time massive SQL queries for each set of information needs, is creating small queries that will be the mappings between relational database to the ontology. So the effort now is a more incremental and modular effort where they're trying to define these links from database to the ontology, and also at the same time extending this ontology. And in this way, very simple SPARQL queries, according to ontology, were automatically transformed into very large SQL queries. But then the IT expert, again, was just defining the small links between concepts in the ontology to where this information was in the database. So now I'm going to change. So now I was discussing how to add semantics or knowledge or use knowledge graphs in data science and also data access. Sometimes you just need to access the data before doing any data science. And then I'm going to move more on to how to contribute, or knowledge graph can contribute into machine learning. Now could be a good moment for questions if you have any questions about this first part of the presentation. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep all the questions at the very end. But if there is a very specific question now, please feel free to add it in the chat.
Dr. Ernesto, could you go to the last slide you just mentioned, 34?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one, right?
Yes, yes. Here you are talking about ontology-based data access.
Yes.
Okay.
So basically,
so you mean that disparate sources are there, and we are already motivated that we do not do SQL queries, and ontology-based data access should be there. That is why the need arises that we have to write ontology-driven queries, and then they will be translated to SQL queries and so on. We are already motivated that ontology-based data access is required.
Yes, yeah, here
yes, sir.
Here the main challenge is because it's not necessarily substituting the pipeline they have, but this will enhance some data access. Because the main gap was between what is in the database, which is very far from the information needs. And then we're trying to put closer the information needs to the queries, no? Like, because the queries in this scenario, they are formulated according to the ontology. And the ontology has been created together with the domain experts. So it's going to use the vocabulary the domain experts understand. While the database will have very strange table names. And indeed, when I was analyzing together with other the databases, the ones with nice names were empty, and then the real data were in other tables. It was very hard to understand, no? And of course to run the query. So the idea is like the query at the domain expert end would be very simple. Then of course one could argue they need to learn now SPARQL queries instead of SQL queries. But then we also provide a visual interface so that they could formulate simple queries using a graph visual interface. So they did, in the end, they didn't even need to learn SPARQL, no? Because also could be a bit difficult for domain expert without semantic web background. But then what we prove or showcase is like small SPARQL queries, trying to gather most of the information that was needed, was translated into very large SQL queries in an automatic fashion, which otherwise the IT expert was the one trying to create these very big SQL queries, trying to harness information from the databases. But the challenge as well was it's not something you install day one and it works. It's something you need to create incrementally. You need to create an ontology that covers some information needs and create the mappings between the ontology and the data. And that probably was the main challenge, no? Because sometimes you expect to install some system and it works day one. And it's something that it will work, but it's going to be a process.
Yeah, thank you. I got it.
Okay, welcome. So then for the semantics for machine learning, it's also a relatively hot topic nowadays, both in the semantic web community and the machine learning communities. Because we feel, or at least I feel, like we need more powerful AI systems, no? And that they are semantically sound, you can provide explanations, and they are reliable. No? In the end, you should be able to know why a machine learning system, no, or AI system is giving you this prediction. No? And then, I mean, deep learning is amazing, but also feel like if there is more and more data, then they can code very well. But then also, on the one hand, they lack explanation, but then also they need more and more data. And then maybe adding semantics could at least relax, no, that when the data is not available or there is not such amount of data. But at the same time, also, now I'm trying to point to the weak points, no, of deep learning, but also I would like to point the weak points of knowledge representation. No? Like in the end, it's something that you need to create. Sometimes it's hard to maintain. If it predicts something, if it's always true, but then of course sometimes you have minor variations in the data, you are not able to predict certain things, which in machine learning typically you, with more or less confidence, you can still predict things. So now one of the main initiatives is trying to create this hybrid learning system and reasoning system, no? Trying to combine the best from deep learning or machine learning and the best from knowledge representation. And yeah, well, not necessarily always deep learning, but then in most cases it will be deep learning nowadays. So we are trying to, these hybrid learnings go a bit beyond. No? We are trying to unify data-driven systems with knowledge-driven methods. No? It could be deep learning, but could be beyond that. And then in this case, we are trying to bring some sort of ontologies or logic-based formalism to the hybrid system. And then in the bottom, there is a nice paper where it describes different patterns. Possibly it's not a complete set of patterns, but it gives you an idea on the current state of the art, how it fits into this pattern, where they combine machine learning and symbolic reasoning. So in this line, we have been trying to provide our 2 cents as well, and we are trying to create ontology embeddings. And this fits in one of the patterns that they are described in this paper. So the idea is like we start with some sort of symbolic representation, and then we are getting a vector representation out of them, which this vector representation can be used later on, as we will see. And it's trying to capture the semantics of the symbolic representation, an ontology, into the vector space, into a numerical space. And in this line, we created a system called AutoVec, which falls into, there are quite a few knowledge graph embedding approaches. And then here there is I try to provide a classification. Like the more common classification is into matrix factorization system, geometric transformation systems, and deep learning based systems that they try to transform a knowledge graph into each entity in the knowledge graph into the vector space. But also there are quite a few new systems, including AutoVec, that they rely on a language model to transform, in the case of AutoVec, an owl ontology, or the entities that appear in an owl ontology, into the vector space. And basically the way Autobake works, we were really inspired on a previous system called RDF2Vec, where they transform the graph, they perform walks on the graph and create sentences according to the working strategies. And basically out of the walks on the graph, they create a document. And then once you have this document, you can run Word2Vec or any language model. So Autobake got the inspiration from RDF2Vec, and instead of projecting just RDF data, it does projects, it creates a graph representation of the ontology. So the starting point is an owl ontology, which is composed by a set of axioms. So it transforms this into a graph. It does some sort of approximation, but it tries to preserve as much information as possible. And also something that it is typically ignored in RDF2Vec and knowledge graph embedding approaches is the lexical information. So we wanted to preserve as much as lexical information from the ontologies as well. Because the labels and the description around an entity are also very important to describe that entity. Especially some ontologies that are not, logically, they are not very rich, but lexically they contain many synonyms, descriptions, and so on. So we try to also keep this into the projection and exploit this when we were transforming from the graph representation into a document, especially because then we are applying a language model. So as much lexical information as we provide, the better. And here is just an example of what we were doing. So on the right-hand side, you have a hierarchy coming from the ontology. And then on the left-hand side, you have different sentences we were creating. So we were applying different working strategies and also with different strategies to create the documents. So what we call a structured document is where we are only putting in the document the URIs of the entities. So we are working the graph, and then we are working from entity to entity, and then in every jump we create something in the document. So in the first example, we have beer we have food with a type of beer depending in which direction, and so on, and has nutrient and so on. But only we are using the URIs. While you go to the bottom to the middle example, we also provide a lexical document. So instead of putting the URIs in the document, we put the label of this entity. And then we have the combined document where it tries to create sentences mixing only words and, mixing words and URIs. And the idea is to create some strong correlation between URIs, that would be between the URIs of the entities, and also between the lexical information that appears on those entities, trying to have this correlation between not only word to word, but also word to URI. And currently, Autobake relies on Word2Vec as a neural language model. And then the key is, since the document is going to mix words with URIs, we're going to get vector embeddings for both words and the URIs. And that could be quite powerful, because when we are walking the graph, we are trying kind of traversing the relationships in the ontology. But at the same time, we are including the lexical representation. So we are trying to keep this correlation of the information that appears in labels and descriptions. And so, yeah, this is just as an example. For blonde beer, we were going to get a vector for the entity representing blonde beer, but also for the words blonde and beer. And then that could be very powerful and very tailored to the ontology, or to the case we are working with. And again, the applications could be several. In the Autobake paper, we tried to evaluate the embeddings in a class assumption and class membership prediction scenario. We tried to see how good they were, the embeddings with respect to other approaches. But then originally, the first time we designed Autobake, even the original paper, there is Autobake star, and there is another paper that describes Autobake. That was the original contribution. And the main idea we have is apply this to on-tool alignment. And that is why the lexical information was, of course, playing a key role. And it's something we applied recently, trying to exploit this out-of-back embeddings into an on-tool alignment setting in a project that where Samsung Research UK is interested as well, now how to map food ontologies in this case. And also we are other tasks we try to apply out-of-back for ontology clustering, trying to see if you're able to cluster things that are related to each other, which indeed is the case. And okay, now we saw, for example, a contribution, like out-of-back trying to transform from symbolic representation to vector embeddings. But this is not the end. Like the idea was to apply this in different scenarios, like onto alignment. And in this case, as the same, we are. I'm going to present a use case where we are trying to learn with knowledge graph embedding for a specific use case. And this fits into this pattern where on the left-hand side, we transform symbolic representation, like a knowledge graph or ontology, into a vector representation. We use this for training, and then we do prediction, and then the prediction in the end also goes back, of course, to the symbol. It could be reused as a symbolic representation, if something is classified in a given with a given label. And here we have been working in how to learn with knowledge graph embeddings into an ecotoxicological use case, where we try to predict which chemicals were dangerous with which species, to which species. And so we have some information from the lab, but then what we were lacking is actually the knowledge graph itself. So quite a lot of effort as well in this work was trying to create a knowledge graph for ecotoxicology. That's what we call the Terra knowledge graph, where we're trying to include information from chemical data, but also information from a species, and also ecotoxicology information, like which species are affected by which chemicals. And so in the end, we try to run knowledge graph embedding approaches into this Terra knowledge graph, and we have some evidence, like a chemical one is affecting a species one, and so on, and also in cases where it wasn't affecting a species two. But then the idea was to leverage this representation, to discover, like if a chemical for pairs chemical species that were for which we didn't have any data, we wanted to predict, if actually indeed chemical 3 was affecting species 3, for example. And then also we realized that it was very important to, when we were doing the experiments, isolate the cases where we didn't know anything about the chemical. Well, we knew things about the chemical, but we didn't know which species was affecting. So basically, we're can be seen as an unknown chemical and species, where we didn't really have any effect data. We didn't know if they were affected by chemicals, or in case of the chemical was affecting the species. And in this case, exploiting the information from the knowledge graph was very important, because then otherwise using classical machine learning was leading to random results, because the pair chemical or the chemicals and species were completely unknown. So the background knowledge of the knowledge graph was very important, to see how similar a chemical was to another chemical for which we knew something, and similarly to species. So in this paper, in the end, we have different settings for the prediction, and I mean, in one of the settings, the knowledge graph is playing a key role. And also to do this, that's a very overcomplicated architecture of our model, where we are trying to jointly learn the knowledge graph embeddings, or the embeddings for the entities. At the same time, we are learning the prediction of if a chemical is affecting a species. And that was leading to very interesting results. And pretty much this is almost the end of my presentation. Before finishing, I wanted to just give a very quick overview of the notion of the knowledge scientist. It's not something I created. So I'm gonna be very quickly, we already saw this. That's something, I see a knowledge scientist as a combination of data engineers, knowledge engineers, data scientists, where you bring the semantics and you bring in the end, you make the data more reliable and clean, no? and semantically well described. And this is a notion that, as I said, I didn't create. It was there is a paper by George, Paul, and Juan Sequeda, where they describe this new notion of knowledge scientists, and it's something that can play a very important role in industry and any organization, no? And I don't see yet many open positions for knowledge scientists, and they're given different names like knowledge engineer or knowledge graph engineer. But in some cases, I think what the industry is looking for is for this knowledge scientist, no? Where it basically relies on semantic web technology and makes the data more reliable. And it's something, just to finish, I will put knowledge scientists in more or less this picture. No, it's something in between data engineer that will harness the data and the data scientist that will draw some value, no, for and get some insights. Sometimes what I see is like the same person is trying to be a data engineer, knowledge scientist, and data scientist, and that could be challenging, no, because then you need a lot of skills. So knowledge scientists will combine those skills, but then of course without going so much in depth as a scientist or a data engineer, no, like we are trying to split a bit the duties, and the knowledge scientist, of course, is going to intersect with the data scientist knowledge and data engineer without being that expert, no, let's say. And that's everything. Yeah, thanks a lot. And you have any questions, just now is the time, either in the chat or you can ask me directly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ernesto. So for the participants, do you have any questions? I just want to ask do you have any further direction and also challenges in this area?
Yeah, I mean, in this combination of machine learning and symbolic representation, yeah, one challenging is not adding an unnecessary overhead. Especially because, I mean, doing symbolic reasoning is sometimes time consuming if you have a large amount of data. I mean, also doing training a very big model, it may take a lot, no? But then the combination should be still practical. And in some cases that might be problematic. I mean, it wasn't the case on this in ecotoxicology, because the pattern basically works. I mean, you do knowledge graph embeddings, which is relatively quick, and then you do learning afterwards. So it's not completely integrating, no? In the future, I would like to see hybrid models where everything is together, no? Like basically the learning and the reasoning happens all together. And there are some efforts. We have, for example, at City, they created or they help in the design of logic tensor networks. So there are some initiatives, no? But I would like to see them more applying in practice, no? And then being actually applicable. But it may take some time as well, no? To define robust techniques for research, but also that they can be applied in industry.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Ernesto, yeah. I want to ask you if you could spend a few more minutes on the knowledge graph embedding models, the slide you had.
Yeah, let me go back. Didn't specify. You're right. So we didn't really. I didn't put in the slides. Yeah, we use many models. So I can go back to, because in this case for ecotoxicology we didn't use Autodeck because it was kind of two works that were growing in parallel, but we use most of the embedding models that appear in this slide, apart from language models. We didn't use language model as well because the lexical information in ecotoxicology were not that relevant. But in this effort in ecotoxicology, we use many of the several systems that they fall into matrix factorization, also geometric transformation and deep learning. So in the paper, we tried to evaluate quite a lot of them because we didn't know which ones were leading to the best results. Our hypothesis was like, okay, knowledge graph will help. But then we didn't want to fall into the problem of, okay, maybe knowledge graph help, but then this concrete deep knowledge graph embedding approach is not useful. So in the end, we tried to evaluate a good set of systems, and we identified the ones that were working better in representing species data and chemical data.
Okay, then also if you have any specific results with you, any liking, maybe specifically for the language models.
We have, can you say again?
Which one are performing better in a generalized manner? Any special liking? Do you like one of them?
I mean, for the knowledge graph embedding approaches, there were, I think if I mind doesn't, because here I didn't, I think this, for the ecotoxicology, the matrix factorization, Dismalt was working, I think these two, Dismalt and Holly, were working, were giving very good results. I think Dismalt, Holly, and Combi, I think in the paper you can see more like all the combinations. If I remember correctly, there were three of them. I think these three, they were leading to interesting results. And then in involving language models, using Autobec was also leading to very interesting results, especially because it exploits the lexical information. So when we evaluated Autobec, for example, into an ontology alignment setting, was the one performing the best, because the others, they rely only on the structure. And then in an ontology alignment system, we have two ontologies which potentially have very different graph structure. So the lexical information is also very important. And it's why Autobec, even sometimes using only Word2Vec, leads better results that knowledge graph embedding approaches when the lexical information is key. And then Autobec tries to bring both things at the same time. So, I mean, coming back to your question, probably don't really have an absolute winner. But in ecotoxicology, at least given the scenario, there were these three systems. They seem to always lead to the best results. But yeah, in other setting, maybe we have another winner.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. And yeah, I see in the chat that someone is asking. I will share the slides. That's not a problem. I will share also with the organization. I don't know if you would like to share the slides online as well.
All right. Is there any more questions from the participants? All right. If no more questions, then thank you very much for Dr. Ernesto for your presentation. It's a very good presentation. Thank you very much. And then we are going to the next